looks like that it would take it out. And then eventually Darwinism got a whole new theory. Then it took 20 or 30 years to assemble it, based on a whole different conceptual apparatus, bunch of whole different concepts, which would include other statistically measurable evolutionary forces than natural selection, such as genetic drift, gene migration, frequency dependence, density dependence, so forth, things that were literally inconceivable in the first version of Darwinism. And inside of that context, you got all kinds of interesting models of speciation. They still compete with each other, and one of the explanations of that isn't that they're explanatory bad, but that nature is so complex that it finds all kinds of different things, and one of the ways biology, evolutionary biology differs from physics is that nature is pretty complicated, and models are not as uniform all over the whole thing. It helps to have a kind of an arsenal of them. Now, I think that commenting on Dr. Fulton's idea, I think that the most creative thing about science is and the one that's least predictable, is the conceptual leaps that make the cumulativeness that we've all noticed in it, I hope, possible. Those conceptual leaps, those reformulations of concepts are very unpredictable, and all kinds of new things. So this hope that she expressed of some theory that would actually do better at the molecular level, it seems to me, firstly, reasonably well placed with respect to the past history. In other words, it's a weak induction that I'm making from the point of view of the track record, not just of science in general, but of the Darwinian tradition, which is like a cat that has 9 lives. All right, now, what I want to say, and this is my last point, I think, here, is that I could concede to Dr. Behe, and I will, that the current inference to the best explanation of design, I'll concede right now, is pretty plausible, given this ignorance that we're all confessing about I think that we'll never get to that until we get to a theory of the origin of life. You don't look for the theory of the origin of life in the Journal of Molecular Biology. They're all kinds of, and it's not obvious that natural selection could explain it, since the origin of life is one of the things that's supposed to explain the emergence of natural selection. You wouldn't expect Darwinism to be crammed down to that prebiotic level. What you want to see is the emergence of very complicated systems of proteins and replicating macromolecules, probably in a coevolutionary situation, that slowly give you the life in which the kind of pathways that we see that are genetically controlled actually settle down. And the ones that we're talking about here are ones that often, like hemoglobin, these molecules, they have a long evolutionary history. They're we know that they're conserved across many, many phyla. They've had a long time to go through the putt-putt stage. They're settled down. They're buffered. So buffered are they, in fact, that, as you well know, the biggest threat to Darwinism at the molecular level came from neutral mutation theory, because the idea is that amino acids and protein chains replace each other evolutionarily at a clock-right, regular way, independent of selective value in a given environment. That was seen already in the early 70s as a refutation of Darwinism at the early level. One possible explanation of that is that these molecules and the way they are functionally embedded into systems are so well buffered, as it were, so efficient that you can change amino acids, it doesn't do a darn thing. They're not all that vulnerable. I think you have to admit that, what do I think you have to admit? That you shouldn't look for Darwinism at the level of origin of life, and that the mystery that Dr. Fulton wants to solve, and Dr. Behe, about molecular pathways is probably going to be solved, if it's solved at all, I share her faith that it probably will be, by having a better view of the origin of life first, which we don't yet have. Well, finally, if I say, okay, right now, I'm going to concede that inference to the design is the best explanation. Now, I don't think that that really gets you very much any more than I think it gets the creationism much to buy into this argument. That is the providential creationist. Like the bare notion of natural selection, the bare notion of design is merely an idea. It's not a theory. To become a theory, it would have to be articulated in the way that I've described. It would have to be turned into the core of a scientific research tradition. It would have to be dressed out by models. It would have to be brought to bear on all kinds of things. So I do not think, as Dr. Behe says, that a design must be ranked as one of the greatest achievements in the history of science, that the discovery of it rivals Newton, Einstein, Lavoisier, Schrödinger, Pasteur, or Darwin. That's a quote from the book. What these men did not have, they didn't have only an idea, but they began to articulate it into a theory that was capable of being re-articulated into a scientific research tradition and brought to bear on cases by mathematical modeling, technological experimentation, replication, and used to blow other research traditions out of the water. The bare idea of design is not comparable to all that. In saying that it is the currently best explanation of irreducible complexity, therefore, I'm not saying much. So this time I'm asking Dr. Behe to tell me, show me where the money is. Now, inference to the best explanation is a technical term in the philosophy of science. It's the current criterion for scientific success. It's supposed to replace all kinds of epistemological entanglements about induction and falsification and all that sort of thing. It makes science center on how things actually work, as his argument does, rather than on how possibly or on why necessarily questions. It isn't. Now, I congratulate Dr. Behe on shifting the discussion of creation and natural selection to this firmer ground, forgetting all these battles about induction and falsifiability that characterized earlier style scientific creationism. Still, when it comes to appealing to the mere idea of design, I'm not really inferring to the best explanation at all. Stop. I'll give you 1 minute. First, it's not an inference to the best explanation, since the very power of Dr. Behe's argument against molecular Darwinism shows that there are no rival inferences that it beats. Ideas are pretty good at answering how possibly questions, but they're not very good at answering how actually questions. It seems to me then you wouldn't want to just weaken this by saying that, it would be contradictory to the spirit of what he says to try to turn this thing about design into a how it could possibly arise. He wants to say how it actually could arise. And I think that in order to do that, you'd have to find a more theory-backed argument like you'd find in normal science. Those are the points I wanted to make, and partly because I really wanted to hear what Dr. Behe had to say about them. Thank you.
I really appreciate Professors Depew and Fulton offering their comments. It's clear that this is a very controversial subject, and there's a lot here to think about, and it's great that we can do it here in this academic setting. Well, while they were talking, I was furiously writing notes, and I'm sure I won't get to all the points that they covered, and I'll have to address them kind of sporadically. So forgive me if it sounds a little bit disjointed. Now, let me start with Professor Depew's remarks first. Just saying what I can here. The first thing is that he mentions that other research traditions, such as like those of Newton and so forth, when they were put forward, they generated a lot of research, and that the intelligent design program would have to generate a lot of research too. And that's certainly true, and I look forward to being part of that. But I'd just like to point out that if intelligent design generates 1 or 2 papers, that will be 1 or 2 more attempts at explanation for some of these complex systems than have been generated by Darwinism. Perhaps you remember the 0 I put up on my slide, and it's admitted essentially by most evolutionary biologists that Darwinism doesn't try to explain these things. So we're not trying to replace an explanation. We're trying to address a problem that so far has been unaddressed. Additionally, Professor Depew and to an extent Professor Fulton talked about conceptual leaps, and they said that I was so thrilled to have Professor Depew even for the moment concede that the current inference design is plausible. But he says that if we get a conceptual leap, perhaps we can explain where the origin of life something to explain the origin of life, and perhaps then we could go on to explain other things as well. But for some reason, he doesn't see the design as being a conceptual leap. He seems to think, and Professor Fulton too, that we should avoid this concept of design because we're looking for an explanation. We're looking for a real explanation. Well, design purports to be a real explanation. And you can't say that, well, yes, it looks good now until a real explanation comes along. You have to, the point of proposing intelligent design is that that the evidence looks like that's the way things actually occurred. Well, there's this. Why should we expect a different explanation? Let me give you an analogy to something. Professor Fulton, I think, said that we should wait. Not all problems are solvable right away. In the future, we might have an explanation for some of this complexity. So there's no sense in being premature in concluding design. Well, let's go back 70 years and cross over to a different discipline, to astronomy, and ask ourselves what happened when it was first noticed that the galaxies were not stationary, but seemed to be rushing away from each other and from the Earth. And that was the beginning of the Big Bang hypothesis. Now, many people thought that the Big Bang hypothesis had theological implications, and a lot of people didn't like those implications. What if somebody had said, let's not be premature? Maybe in a decade or two or three, an explanation will come up to explain how these galaxies can appear to be rushing away, but still have a stationary, static, eternal universe, which is more congenial to some people's philosophies. If that were the case, then the science of astronomy and physics would have been out a lot of research, just biding their time, waiting for a more palatable model to come along. The point of design is not that, or the arguments that I and others have made, is not that we have proved there's absolutely no way Darwinism can explain this. How can I prove that there's absolutely no explanation? That's trying to prove a negative. The essential argument is that these things sure look designed. There's no other explanation currently on the table that purports to explain them. Why don't we try design as an explanation, see how far it gets us? That's the way science has always worked in the past, and I was always told in my scientific training that we should not worry about philosophical explanations, but we should follow the data where it seems to lead. I think we should continue to follow the data where it seems to lead in this case as well. Let me pass over to several of Professor Fulton's comments too. Much of what she says is true. Some biochemists aren't interested in design, but some are. Certainly Russell Doolittle is extremely interested in Darwinian evolution. Russell Doolittle is very interested in Darwinian evolution and is a very prominent person. By and large, biochemists are not so interested in evolution. But I put a different interpretation on that than does Professor Fulton. Biochemists are interested in problems that look solvable. If a problem looks like it could be solved under a current paradigm, you'll see them flocking around the problem like, flies to sugar. But when a problem looks insolvable, well, there are other problems to work on. Before 1952, before Stanley Miller's experiment, hardly anybody worked on the origin of life. After his experiment, a lot of people came and tried to work on that. Now, in the past decade or so, as more and more intractable problems have been thrown up by this research, people are again drifting away from that field. Biochemists work on things that look tractable. Darwinian explanations for these things don't look tractable. So therefore, I think that's the reason why they don't work on them. Professor Fulton says that the difficulty of a problem goes up as the size goes down. That's certainly true. It's hard work to try to analyze some of these things. But just because it's hard work, that's not an excuse to avoid the problem or to assign an explanation for it as a default, an explanation which does not seem to comport with what we know. For example, I'm sure atomic physics is very difficult. But physicists did not shrug their shoulders and say, well, we'll just think of them as little Newtonian billiard balls instead of actually going out and investigating them. So I agree, it's certainly hard work, but nonetheless, we still have to have an obligation to study them. Two more points. The one is a very good point. She speaks of Karen Smith's book and talks about him talking about scaffolding. You might have a complex structure, but it's actually, you know, if you build a scaffolding, you can build it step by step and then take away the scaffolding and it looks like it was, could not be built by itself. For example, a stone archway where you take the keystone away, it crumbles. The only point that I wish to make is that the scaffolding is an intelligently designed anticipation of this archway that is the subject of, that is being built. The person building the scaffolding is looking into the future, anticipating and planning and designing. And so I'm not sure that this is the best analogy for Darwinian evolution. The final question, which is, you know, has many implications, is, well, who is this designer? And what properties does this designer have, and so on. And this ties into the theological points that Professor Depew raised. And I think for right now, probably many of us have our own candidates for who the designer is. But as far as science goes, I think we can just say that that is a question that can be put off into the future. For example, and that's been done in the past many times, but just for a recent example, we can ask ourselves, what started the Big Bang? Nobody knew when the Big Bang theory was first proposed, and nobody knows now. Nonetheless, from the pattern of the motions of the galaxies, the idea of the Big Bang first sprang forth. People didn't know what started it, but they could tell this was a pattern that looked like an explosion. Why don't we investigate this idea? In the same way, irreducible complexity is a pattern we always see in design. Well, is always a, as far as we know, a signature of design. Who is the designer? Well, again, maybe science won't be able to address that question. Maybe science can address that question in 100 years. But right now, these things sure look designed. We can do research under a design paradigm. We can put off the question and address that in the future. So again, I'd like to thank Professors Depew and Fulton for raising these questions and for the interesting discussion.
Before I take questions from the audience, I would like to recognize one person. I'm very pleased that one of our graduate students, an Iowa fellow, David Anders, was very much involved in promoting the idea of this as a topic that would be an interesting one to the University of Iowa community. And I think he actually offered and made the first contact and invited Professor Behe here. David, raise your hand. He's a graduate student in School of Religion. Thank you. So the floor is open for questions for any of our panelists. Please, John.
I think it's converging with the question that both Professor Fulton and Professor Depew asked, but maybe I can try it my own way. I'm curious about what you think, where you think this leads science. And there are two parts to the question, but let me just restrict myself to one. Could you tell us or send us someplace we might look
Well, no, I think we can do work on the design hypothesis right now. And the one obvious thing to do is say, well, what has been designed? Just because some things have been purposely designed does not mean that other things could not have originated by natural selection, or other things by serendipity, by accident, or genetic drift, or any of a number of other mechanisms that biologists invoke. One thing you can do is say, well, you know, the systems I showed you are really kind of the Cadillacs of complexity in biochemistry. Other things are not so complex. We can ask ourselves, can they develop by natural selection? And no.
Then I'm asking you, what kinds of questions should I be asking? And when you say it's like intelligent design, you're talking about people. So I know what kinds of questions to ask. I mean, what did they design it for? And what did they design it from? And what can I expect them to do in the future? Right? So there are questions about intentional systems that you can ask. And your proposal is that we should be asking roughly about nature. And that's part of it. And I'm not sure that's right. But then that leads to my second question about where does the system come? Because there was a time, right at the beginning of the scientific revolution, where people began suggesting that this was a hypothesis that they could find. And it looked very much as if those were kinds of questions that couldn't be answered with respect to nature. As a matter of fact, you might get farther by not asking them and viewing nature as something that didn't have purpose to design, and letting the question about for what purpose did it design last for science. This is the benefit. And one of my instructors in the graduate school had an argument that actually what they attempt to put two dialogues concerning natural evolution in the form of modern statistics. The argument was that if you look at the track record and at the relative quality of the relative success of different strategies for explaining natural phenomena, Behe's theorem would suggest that the divine hypothesis has a very low antecedent probability, and so our best bet would be to look elsewhere, even in cases where we don't know now.
Well, I'd say that was a selective reading of the history of science. First of all, I think people forget that, you know, a century ago, science thought that the universe was infinite and eternal. And it was easy to explain just by saying it was always there. But now, physics has shown that it seems to have had a beginning. And that seems to be much trickier to explain. A century ago, science, or many scientists, thought that the life arose spontaneously from various things. And that went down, and then Stanley Miller's experiments were done, and scientists were very excited about being able to explain the origin of life. But after 4 decades or so of research, the problem of the origin of life looks much more intractable than it did in the kind of heady days after his work. Again, a while back, the evolution of cells and things like that looked like they would be a lot easier to explain than they've turned out to be. So I would say that, contrary to the urban legend, science's record at explaining things without invoking design is pretty spotty. And that, in fact, the untold story of this century is how much different branches of science, from the Big Bang to the things, the anthropic coincidences, to the intractability of the origin of life, to these problems with biochemical systems, how much they all seem to point together to suggest design or information or whatever you want to say. I answered your last question first, and because my memory is extremely short, I've forgotten what your other points.
were questions. Yes.
That isn't zero in the Journal of Molecular Evolution. I'm not a biochemist, so I'll have to shift my ground just a little bit. I'm a developmental biologist. And there's a lot of research going on now in comparative developmental biology, sometimes even for the evolution of development. And what is being discovered is that sometimes very similar molecular regulators are operating in systems that were initially thought to be completely different. Just to give one spectacular example, the compound eye and the type of eye we have were, they're rather different. And they were, as you pointed out, at least our eye, one of the original cases for intelligent design, Darwin. But recently, people have discovered that there are certain master regulatory molecules that we call PAC6, in my memory doesn't correct family, and some rather unusual things show, for example, that the regulatory molecule from, I don't remember if it was humans or mice, when transfected into Drosophila, produced compound eyes in funny places, like on the legs, which suggested that there was a this is an important molecule, not an incidental molecule. This suggested that these two structures which are designed in completely different ways, so the intelligent designer before PAC6 came along, would say the intelligent designer had one design for our eye and another design for the insect eye. Now it looks as if maybe that's not so. Maybe you have to push your intelligent design a little bit further back to the original eye, And it seems to me that you're going to, as research proceeds, you're going to have to, in the end, you're going to probably have to say that what the intelligent designer did was he made the first eukaryotic sexes. The designer made the first eukaryotic cell, and evolution and natural selection proceeded. What would you say to that?
Well, that's a very interesting example. I would say that the PAC6 is a protein which is supposed to be a master regulator of the development of eyes, and it and very similar proteins are seen from fruit flies to mammals, and apparently regulate the development of compound eyes and camera eyes like vertebrates have. I would say that's at least as much of a problem for Darwinian evolution as it is for design. And you talk about thinking the designer had to have made separate eyes and maybe not now. Well, heck, Darwinists up until a few years ago, would tell you confidently that the eye evolved independently 40 different times. But now if you read articles, they'll say, well, maybe it didn't evolve. Maybe there was a proto-eye. So I think that's it. And the fact that they're trying to get compound eyes and camera eyes from a common ancestral something or other is at least as big of a problem for Darwinian evolution as it is for intelligent design or any other theory. Another thing about PAC6 is that it's extremely unexpected. Like PAC6 and its homologs, like I said, they seem to be master regulatory switches. So let me just use a little homey analogy to show you what I think the surprising point is. Suppose you have a switch that turned on your light in the dining room, and the switch was had a big picture of Mickey Mouse on it. Or maybe in your child's bedroom or something like that. You use that to turn it on. And then you go over and you go into the next city and you see there's some, computer or something like that with the identical switch, Mickey Mouse on it, push it up. And you say to yourself, these things must have originated from a common ancestor. Look at their switches are identical. PAC6 is not the construction material of the eye, as far as we know. It's not anything except the thing that turns on the pathway. Why should the thing that turns on the pathway have been conserved when everything else has changed? I'm not saying that's support per se for intelligent design. I'm just saying it's a conundrum within Darwinism as well.
So we have a question here.
Physics and sequencing has a far more accurate determining
overall phenotypic analysis for this.
I'm sorry, I wasn't.
Logistics and sequencing is going to be far more accurate in determining ecological history than overall phenotypic analysis of organisms. I don't want to disagree. But why should it be the opposite case on most of them? In other words, why do we feel that to incorporate Darwinian exploration, we must go to identify possible lands for each imaginary gradual step for that method has been shown to be far less accurate than the irreducible gene sequencing, like in the Journal of Biological especially in light of the fact that, as Professor Bolton pointed out, that we can't easily examine the historical gradual status on a molecular level in comparison to, say, examining historical gradual status on an organism level.
Well, that's a good question. I think the answer is because when you just compare sequences, you're not looking at Darwinian evolution. You're simply looking at common descent. And if you put common descent aside or grant it for purposes of argument, then the next question is, well, what drove this evolution? Evolutionists right now disagree with whether something was drift or whether something was due to natural selection. And suppose somebody like me comes along and say, I think it is due to design. What sequences can you point to that say that this is due to natural selection versus design? It just doesn't address the question. So though I agree with you, it's extremely hard to come up with these steps, and Professor Fulton is certainly right to point out the difficulty of the problem. But unfortunately, if you want to answer the question of whether Darwinian processes are capable of doing these things, then you have no recourse except to do the experiments.
If I may make a small response to that, I noticed you did pick up and agree on the difficulty of it, but you didn't respond to the fact that the support is poor. I think that when evolutionary biologists can blow up cities, they'll be supported the way the atomic physicists are.
Swell.
John?
I have a couple of questions and a final observation, or I guess it's another question. The first question is, what are the data that could lead toward intelligent design as opposed to away from simple Darwinism? The second question is there any experimental outcome that could rule out intelligent design? That is, one might suspect that any observation of a biological structure or function could in fact be explained by intelligent design. Third, I'd like to return to an argument made about intermediate steps. I mean, even something like a mousetrap had to arrive by stepwise improvements of something. One is in mind of the beverage designer who tried 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 up and then gave